January 10th, 1475. Dawn breaks over a frozen valley in Eastern Europe. The snow is stained red. 45,000 Ottoman soldiers lie dead across miles of blood-soaked ice. The most powerful military force on earth, an empire that conquered Constantinople and crushed every Christian kingdom that dared resist, has just been annihilated. They came with 120,000 men, 3 times the strength of their enemy. By nightfall, they were fleeing for their lives, hunted through frozen forests like animals. This is the Battle of Vaslui, one of the most catastrophic defeats in Ottoman history. And the man who orchestrated this impossible victory understood something that most rulers never grasp. You don't defeat an empire by being stronger than them. You defeat them by making conquest cost more than they're willing to pay. His name was Stephen III of Moldavia, and he was prepared to burn his own country to ash to prove his point. This is the story of how a small Christian principality did what everyone said was impossible, and why the lessons of that frozen January morning still echo through military academies 5 centuries later. Before we continue this video, subscribe and like and comment for more video like this. To understand Vaslui, we must go back 22 years to the day the medieval world changed forever. May 29, 1453. The walls of Constantinople, walls that had protected Christian Europe for over 1,000 years, walls that had turned back Persian armies, Arab sieges, and barbarian invasions, came crashing down. The man who broke them was barely old enough to grow a full beard. Sultan Mehmed II had inherited the Ottoman throne at 19 years old. European kings dismissed him as too young, too ambitious, too reckless. The Byzantine emperor Constantine Palaiologos believed that God himself would protect the Queen of Cities. They were catastrophically wrong. Mehmed brought something no previous besieger had possessed: 70 cannons, including a monster called the Basilica, 27 feet of cast bronze that fired half-ton stone balls capable of punching through 12 feet of fortification. He brought 80,000 battle-hardened troops, a navy that literally dragged ships overland to bypass blocked harbors, and a cold, calculated patience that ground down every Byzantine defense. The siege lasted 53 days. When the walls finally shattered and Ottoman soldiers poured through the breach, Emperor Constantine threw off his imperial purple and died fighting in the streets like a common soldier. His body was never identified among the thousands of dead. Mehmed walked into the Hagia Sophia, the magnificent center of Eastern Orthodox Christianity for 900 years, and personally ordered its conversion into a mosque. No hesitation, no compromise. The message to Christian Europe was unmistakable. This wasn't just conquest, this was the erasure of an entire world order. Christian Europe went into collective shock. Constantinople wasn't merely a city, it was the idea, the promise that Christendom had an unconquerable eastern shield. That shield was gone, and the Sultan who shattered it was just beginning his reign of expansion. Over the next 2 decades, Mehmed's armies moved like a relentless tide across the Balkans. Serbia fell within 6 years. Bosnia capitulated within 10. The last remnants of Byzantine Greece were absorbed into the empire. Wallachia, the land ruled by Vlad the Impaler, was beaten into submission and transformed into a vassal state, its princes paying tribute and kneeling before Ottoman authority. By 1475, the Ottoman Empire controlled the Balkans, Anatolia, and the entire Black Sea coast. They possessed the finest infantry in the world, cavalry that could function as both mounted archers and shock troops, and a logistical system capable of supplying massive armies hundreds of miles from their home territories. They hadn't lost a major campaign in an entire generation. And now, there was only one obstacle remaining between them and total dominance of the Black Sea region, a small, forested principality called Moldavia. Act 2. The Principality that Refused to Die.
Moldavia occupied a precarious position wedged between the Carpathian Mountains and the Dniester River. 400,000 people, mostly Orthodox Christian peasants and minor nobility, scattered across forests, river valleys, and rolling hills. It wasn't wealthy, it didn't possess grand cities or legendary fortifications, but it had something the Ottomans desperately needed: geography. Control Moldavia, and you control the northern Black Sea trade routes. You sever Poland's southern connections. You encircle Hungary. You transform the Black Sea into an Ottoman lake with no Christian power capable of challenging your dominance. It was the final piece of the strategic puzzle, and Mehmed II knew it. But Moldavia had survived this long for a reason, and that reason wasn't military strength, it was strategic position. Surrounded by predators on every side, Ottomans to the south, Crimean Tatars to the east, Poland to the north, Hungary to the west, each one powerful enough to crush Moldavia independently. So Moldavia played them against each other in an exhausting dance of diplomatic survival. Alliance with Poland when Ottoman pressure increased, tribute payments to the Tatars when Poland turned hostile. A careful, calculated game that required perfect timing and absolutely no mistakes. One wrong diplomatic move and Moldavia would vanish like Serbia, like Bosnia, like every other principality that thought it could negotiate with empires on equal terms. For 18 years, Moldavia had avoided that fatal mistake because the man ruling it understood something fundamental about empires that most princes never learned. They don't respect strength, they respect cost. His name was Stephen III, and in 1474, he decided to teach the Ottomans a lesson in economics.
The next morning, Mehmet's army advanced toward Targovishte. And then they encountered something that stopped them cold. A forest of stakes stretching for miles along the road. 20,000 impaled Ottoman prisoners from Vlad's earlier raids arranged in perfect rows. Some had been dead for weeks, others were still dying. The smell alone made hardened soldiers vomit. Horses refused to move forward. Mehmet stopped his entire army and stared at this forest of the dead for hours, processing what he was seeing. Then he ordered the advance to continue, because terror without strategy is just theater. Vlad had made the Ottomans afraid, but he hadn't made them incapable. His army was too small, his resources too limited, his fortifications too weak to withstand a prolonged siege. Within months, Mehmet installed Vlad's own brother, Radu, on the Wallachian throne. Vlad fled into exile, was eventually hunted down and imprisoned by the very Hungarians who'd promised to support him. Stefan watched all of this unfold from across the border, and he learned a critical lesson. Brutality gets attention, but it doesn't win wars against empires. What wins wars is making the enemy question whether the prize is worth the rivers of blood they'll have to wade through to claim it. Now, 12 years later, Stefan was about to apply that lesson. Because the man Mehmet sent to destroy Moldavia was the same battle-hardened commander who'd stood beside him at Constantinople's walls. Hadim Suleiman Pasha, governor of Rumelia, veteran of 2 decades of Balkan campaigns, and he was coming with an army larger than anything Stefan had ever faced in his life. Winter 1474. The Ottoman army assembled in Bulgaria and Wallachia like a gathering storm. Hadim Suleiman Pasha commanded between 100,000 and 120,000 men. To put this in perspective, this was one of the largest Ottoman forces ever sent into Europe during the entire 15th century, larger than the army that conquered Bosnia, larger than the force that crushed Serbia. This wasn't a punitive raid or a show of force. This was designed to be complete extermination. The corps consisted of the Janissaries, Christian boys taken from their families as children, converted to Islam and trained from childhood to be the empire's elite infantry. They fought with muskets, crossbows, and blades. They moved in disciplined formations that would make Roman legions envious, and they died before they retreated. These were the soldiers who had stormed Constantinople's walls under cannon fire and Greek fire, who had broken through when every other unit had failed. Flanking them were the Sipahi, provincial cavalry paid through the Timar system of land grants in exchange for military service, skilled horse archers who could fire accurately at full gallop or charge with lances like European knights. Their loyalty was absolute because it was purchased with land and sustained by the promise of more conquests. Then came the vassals, Wallachian troops under Basarab Laiota, the very man Stefan had tried to depose, Serbian auxiliaries, Bulgarian levies. These men had no love for the Ottomans, but they had families living in occupied territories, and disobedience meant death for everyone they loved. And finally, the Akinji, irregular raiders whose sole purpose was simple and terrifying: ride ahead of the main army, burn everything, spread terror, break the enemy's will before the real battle even began. Suleiman's strategy was straightforward and proven: march north through Moldavia in 2 massive columns, devastate the countryside systematically, force Stefan into open battle where superior numbers would decide the outcome within hours, then besiege the fortresses one by one until Moldavia surrendered unconditionally. But there was one detail that made this invasion different from typical Ottoman summer campaigns: the timing. Suleiman was invading in deep winter: snow, freezing temperatures, frozen rivers. Traditionally, armies didn't campaign in winter. Too difficult to supply, too brutal on the men, too unpredictable. But Suleiman had calculated brilliantly. Winter would catch Stefan unprepared. Poland couldn't send reinforcements through snow-choked mountain passes. Hungary wouldn't risk its army in these freezing conditions. Stefan would be isolated, unable to mobilize his full strength, forced to fight alone against overwhelming odds. It was tactically brilliant, except for one critical problem: Stefan wanted to fight alone.
Stephen had 40,000 men, less than half of what Suleiman was bringing south. The corps consisted of the Kurteni, professional soldiers Stephen maintained and paid personally, trained, disciplined, loyal. They were his hammer. Then came the Viteji, lesser nobles and their retainers who owed military service in exchange for landholdings. Competent fighters, but their loyalty was to their estates first, their prince second. The largest group was the Razish, free peasants who owned their land and fought to keep it. They had no formal military training, but they knew every forest path, every river crossing, every hidden valley in Moldavia. And they understood with absolute clarity what Ottoman conquest meant: slavery, forced conversion, their children taken for the Janissary Corps. That understanding made them the most dangerous men in Stephen's entire army. Stephen had spent 17 years preparing for exactly this moment. He'd studied every Ottoman victory, dissected every tactical formation, analyzed every strategic decision, and he'd reached one unshakable conclusion: never fight them on open ground where their cavalry can maneuver. Never let them choose the battlefield. Never give them the opportunity to use their numerical superiority effectively. So when his commanders gathered in December 1474 and asked how they could possibly defend against 120,000 battle-hardened Ottoman soldiers, Stephen gave an order that made half of them question whether he'd lost his mind. Burn everything. Not just military supplies. Everything. Villages, crops, livestock, grain stores. Evacuate the entire population northward. Poison every well. Destroy anything the Ottomans could possibly use for food or shelter. Turn Moldavia into a frozen wasteland. One of his boyars, a nobleman who'd fought beside Stephen for a decade, stood up in the council chamber. His voice was shaking, not from fear, but from barely controlled rage. You're asking us to destroy our own country, to make our own people homeless in the middle of winter. Stephen didn't blink. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stated the mathematics of survival. I'm asking you to choose between rebuilding and slavery. Suleiman is bringing 120,000 mouths to feed and tens of thousands of horses that need constant forage. They're invading in winter because they believe we're unprepared. So we make winter our greatest ally. We deny them food, we deny them shelter, we deny them an easy target. We make every single mile they march north cost them men, morale, and time. And if this strategy doesn't work, if we fail, then we were dead anyway. At least this way, we have a chance. The room fell into heavy silence, because everyone in that council chamber understood what Stephen wasn't saying out loud. This strategy required Moldavian civilians to suffer terribly. Families would lose everything they'd spent generations building. Some wouldn't survive the brutal evacuation in freezing temperatures. Villages that had stood for centuries would simply vanish from the earth. But the alternative was watching those same families dragged south in chains to Ottoman slave markets, watching their daughters sold to harems, watching their sons converted and trained to conquer other Christian lands. Stephen issued the orders that very night. Evacuation began immediately. By the time Suleiman's massive army crossed the frozen Danube in late December, Moldavia was already burning, and the Ottomans were marching directly into a frozen graveyard that would swallow them whole. Late December 1474. The Ottoman army crossed the Danube and pushed north into Moldavian territory like a conquering flood. The first day, morale was exceptionally high. This was supposed to be straightforward, a repeat of Serbia, of Bosnia, of every other Balkan principality that had crumbled under the weight of Ottoman military superiority. The soldiers expected some resistance, then inevitable collapse, then plunder, warmth in captured buildings, and complete victory before the worst of winter set in. By the third day, they discovered the first village. Empty, completely empty. Every building had been systematically stripped. No food, no livestock, no people. Just cold ash where the grain stores had been deliberately burned. The well had something rotting in it, decomposing animal carcasses thrown in deliberately to poison the water supply. The commanders sent scouts ranging ahead in all directions. They returned with identical reports. Village after village, all abandoned, all burned with methodical precision. No civilians anywhere, no supplies of any kind. Nothing but empty shells and poisoned wells.
Suleiman Pasha initially assumed Stefan was retreating in panic, destroying what he couldn't defend in a desperate, futile gesture of defiance. The Ottoman supply trains stretched back hundreds of miles to Wallachia. They had brought extensive provisions for this campaign. This scorched earth policy was an inconvenience, certainly, but not a strategic crisis. Not yet. Then, the temperature dropped viciously. The winter of 1474 to 1475 was brutal even by Eastern European standards. Deep, heavy snow that made every step exhausting. Winds that cut through wool and leather like invisible knives. Temperatures that turned exposed fingers black with frostbite within hours. And the Ottoman army was marching through this frozen hell with no shelter, no hot food, and absolutely no idea where the enemy actually was. The Janissaries maintained their legendary discipline. They always did. Professional soldiers don't panic easily. But the vassal contingents, Wallachians and Serbians forced to fight fellow Christians, began grumbling openly. Morale started cracking at the edges. The Sipahi horses, bred in the warmer climates of Anatolia and the southern Balkans, struggled desperately through massive snowdrifts. Soldiers began falling sick, frostbite, fever, early stages of hypothermia. Still, Suleiman pushed his massive army northward. They'd invested too much, come too far to turn back because of mere discomfort and cold. Then, the raids began in earnest. Moldavian cavalry, light, fast, dressed appropriately for winter conditions, appeared out of the dense forests without any warning. They'd strike Ottoman foraging parties with devastating speed, kill a dozen men in minutes, and vanish completely before any organized response could form. Then they'd appear 5 miles away an hour later and repeat the process. The Ottomans tried desperately to chase them down. Useless, completely useless. The Moldavians knew every deer path, every frozen stream crossing, every location where the forest was too thick for heavy cavalry to follow effectively. By the time Ottoman troops organized any kind of pursuit, the raiders had melted back into the wilderness like ghosts. It wasn't just the mounting casualties that wore them down. It was the relentless psychological exhaustion. No one could sleep properly anymore. Every shadow in the darkness might conceal an ambush. Every rustle in the frozen trees might be enemy scouts. Foraging parties now required heavily armed escorts, which slowed everything to a crawl. Ottoman scouts stopped returning from their reconnaissance missions. Suleiman's intelligence network dried up completely. He knew Stefan's main army was somewhere to the north, somewhere in this frozen wasteland, but where exactly? How many troops? Were they preparing to defend a fortress or planning a major ambush? He had no answers, just growing uncertainty and mounting losses.
By early January 1475, the Ottoman army had marched over 200 brutal miles into Moldavian territory. They hadn't fought a single major engagement, hadn't captured a single strategic objective, but they were already bleeding from 1,000 small wounds. 120,000 men require roughly 200 tons of food every single day just to remain functional as a fighting force. The tens of thousands of horses need constant forage. In deep winter, in a country that had been systematically stripped of everything edible, Suleiman's supply line stretched back over 200 miles through snow, through hostile terrain, through forests where Moldavian raiders ambushed supply wagons and disappeared into the night. The rations got smaller, then smaller again, then smaller still. Desperate soldiers began slaughtering horses for meat, not the precious cavalry mounts, those were still sacred, but the pack animals, which meant even less capacity to transport supplies forward, which meant even less food reaching the front lines in an accelerating death spiral. Men began dying, not from combat, but from cold, from starvation, from dysentery that spread through camps where basic sanitation had collapsed because exhausted soldiers no longer had the energy to maintain it properly. The Wallachian vassals were the first to break discipline openly. Some deserted outright, risking brutal execution because freezing to death in Ottoman service seemed like a worse fate. Others simply stopped following orders with any real urgency or commitment. Why die for an empire that had conquered your homeland and forced you into this frozen hell? Even the Janissaries, trained from childhood to endure absolutely anything, started showing cracks in their legendary composure. Not in their battle readiness, they were still professional soldiers, but in their faces, gaunt, exhausted, silent in a way that spoke of eroding morale.
And through all of this suffering, the Moldavian raids continued with methodical precision. A foraging party ambushed here, a baggage train burned there. Never a major battle that would risk Stefan's limited forces, just constant, grinding attrition that bled the Ottoman army to death without ever giving them a target to destroy. Suleiman understood exactly what was happening to his once mighty invasion force. His army was being systematically destroyed without ever seeing the main enemy force. But he was trapped by the logic of his own situation. By the second week of January, his advance units had reached the Vaslui region. Rolling hills, scattered forests, frozen streams cutting through valleys. Defensible terrain, certainly, but not impossible to overcome. And then his scouts brought him the report he'd been desperately waiting for. Stefan's main army had been spotted. Not retreating northward, not hiding behind fortress walls, deployed in battle formation, ready to fight. Finally, a chance to use his numerical superiority decisively. Suleiman's senior officers urged extreme caution. The army was severely weakened, critically undersupplied, demoralized to a dangerous degree. Perhaps they should consolidate their position, wait for spring when reinforcements and supplies could reach them more easily, or pull back temporarily to establish a proper supply base. But Suleiman understood his situation with brutal clarity, better than his cautious subordinates did. If he retreated without achieving any kind of victory, Mehmed II would have his head removed from his shoulders, literally. The Sultan didn't tolerate failure, especially not from commanders who'd promised easy conquest and delivered disaster. If he besieged a fortress like Suceava without adequate supplies, his army would starve to death before the walls fell. If he kept marching north into increasingly hostile territory, more men would die every single day from cold and hunger and disease, and eventually the army would simply dissolve as a fighting force, melting away through death and desertion. He had exactly one viable option remaining: force a decisive battle, crush Stefan's numerically inferior army with overwhelming force, and end this nightmare campaign before it killed them all. So when Stefan offered him that battle near Vaslui, positioned his army where Suleiman could see them and engage them, the Ottoman commander took the bait eagerly. He didn't realize that Stefan had spent 3 careful weeks engineering this exact moment.
that every burned village, every poisoned well, every ambushed foraging party, every frozen mile of marching had been meticulously designed to bring the Ottoman army to this specific place at this specific time in this specific catastrophic condition. Exhausted, starving, desperate for any kind of victory to justify their suffering. January 10th, 1475. The Frozen Valley. Two armies faced each other across blood-stained snow, and Stefan III of Moldavia was about to demonstrate what happens when you force an empire to fight a war on someone else's terms. The battlefield Stefan had chosen was a valley near Vaslui, approximately 2 miles across at its widest point. Forested heights dominated both flanks. A frozen stream, the Berlid River, cut through the middle at an angle. Rolling hills that looked open enough for massive cavalry maneuvers from a distance, but weren't. The terrain was deceptive, and that deception was entirely deliberate. The Moldavians held the critical high ground on the northern end of the valley, infantry positioned along the tree line in strong defensive positions. Artillery, only a handful of pieces, but they were all Stefan had, placed precisely where they could fire downslope into the valley below with devastating effect. Cavalry forces hidden completely in the dense forests on the both flanks, invisible from the valley floor. The Ottomans deployed in the lower ground, using their standard, proven formation. Janissaries in the center, a solid block of elite professional infantry that had broken armies from Anatolia to the Balkans. Sipahi cavalry on both wings, ready to sweep around the flanks and execute a classic encirclement. Vassal troops held in reserve, artillery positioned to support the infantry advance. On paper, it was absolutely textbook, the same formation that had shattered Hungarian armies at Varna, crushed Serbian forces at Kosovo, broken Byzantine defenses at Constantinople. But paper tactics don't account for half-starved men, exhausted horses struggling through snow, and terrain that only appears favorable from a distance. Suleiman stood with his senior commanders, studying the Moldavian positions carefully through the cold morning air. His officers saw exactly what they expected to see, an outnumbered enemy force forced to make a desperate stand. The mathematics were simple, almost comforting. 120,000 against 40,000, 3-to-1 superiority. Even weakened by the brutal campaign, those odds should be absolutely decisive.
What they didn't see, what they couldn't see from their position, was the ground itself. The valley floor was treacherously uneven beneath its blanket of snow. Snowdrifts concealing deep ditches, frozen stream crossings that looked solid but would crack under sustained weight, scattered brush and hidden obstacles that would break formation cohesion. The slopes weren't dramatically steep, but they were steep enough that cavalry charging uphill would lose critical momentum. And those innocent-looking forests on both flanks weren't just trees and shadows. They were perfect cover for however many cavalry forces Stephen had hidden there, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Stephen stood on the high ground, watching the Ottoman deployment with his most trusted commanders beside him. One of them, a boyar named Stefan Bathuri, who'd fought in a dozen campaigns, looked down at the massive Ottoman force filling the valley below them like a dark tide. His voice was tight with barely controlled fear. "We're outnumbered 3-to-1 against the army that took Constantinople." Stephen didn't take his eyes off the Ottoman formation, slowly organizing themselves below. His voice was calm, almost cold. They marched 200 miles through winter with no food and no rest. Look at their formations carefully. See how slowly they're moving? See the gaps between units that shouldn't be there? That's not an army anymore. That's an exhausted mob holding itself together through discipline and training alone. And if their discipline holds despite everything we've done to them, then we simply make them break it. Early morning, the temperature was well below freezing, breath visible in the frigid air from both armies. Both forces waited in tense silence. Then Suleiman gave the order to begin. The Akinji irregular cavalry went first, as they always did, lightly armored, mounted on fast horses, meant to probe enemy defenses and draw out the opponent's response. They charged up the slope toward the Moldavian vanguard, screaming, firing arrows in clouds. The Moldavian infantry braced themselves in tight formation, pikemen in front presenting a wall of steel points, crossbowmen positioned behind them, a handful of arquebuses, early handheld firearms, slow and cumbersome to reload, but devastating at close range.
The Akinji hit the Moldavian defensive line and were thrown back immediately with heavy casualties. Crossbow bolts tore through their light armor like paper. Arquebuses fired with thunderous reports that spooked horses and killed riders. Pikes caught anyone who pressed too close to the line. The Akinji pulled back, hastily reformed their scattered units, and tried again with more determination. Same result, more dead Ottomans littering the snow. They weren't breaking through. They weren't even close. Suleiman watched from his command position, face expressionless. The probe had failed to achieve its objective, but it told him what he needed to know. The Moldavian vanguard was well entrenched, but not impossibly deep. Perhaps 5,000 men holding that forward position. Behind them, the main defensive line. Hit them hard enough with professional troops, and they'd fold like every other Christian army had folded. He gave the order for a general assault with his best forces. The drums began, deep, rhythmic, terrifying. The Janissaries began their disciplined advance up the slope. Tight formation, coordinated movement. These were professional soldiers moving with the precision of a machine. These were the men who'd stormed Constantinople's ancient walls under withering cannon fire and Greek fire. A Moldavian present defensive line shouldn't even slow them down significantly. The Akinji Sepai on both wings began their flanking maneuvers simultaneously, curving skillfully around the sides of the valley to encircle the Moldavian position from multiple directions. The Moldavian vanguard commander, one of Stephen's most trusted and experienced officers, watched the Janissaries coming toward him. Thousands of them, professional, disciplined, seemingly unstoppable. His orders from Stephen were crystal clear. Hold your position as long as physically possible, then execute a fighting retreat. Make them absolutely convinced they're winning. The Janissaries closed to 100 yards, 50 yards. Moldavian crossbows and arquebuses opened fire in devastating volleys. Ottoman soldiers dropped, but the formations didn't break or waver. They kept coming with terrifying determination. Contact. The sound of it filled the frozen valley. Metal on metal, screams of wounded men, officers shouting urgent orders in Turkish and Romanian. The Moldavian vanguard fought with desperate courage. Pikemen held the line against overwhelming pressure. Swordsmen filled gaps as they appeared. Wounded men kept fighting because retreating too early would destroy Stephen's entire plan. For 20 brutal minutes, they held their ground against the best infantry in the world. Then, at precisely the right moment, the commander gave the predetermined signal.
The Moldavian vanguard began a carefully controlled fighting retreat. Slowly, maintaining formation discipline, pulling back toward the main defensive line step by bloody step, making the Janissaries pay dearly for every single yard of ground, but retreating nonetheless. To the Ottoman commanders watching eagerly from below, it looked exactly like the breakthrough they'd been desperately waiting for. Suleiman saw it too, and his tactical instincts screamed at him to press the advantage. Push them hard, don't let them regroup. The Janissaries surged forward with renewed energy, and behind them, smelling imminent victory after weeks of frozen misery, other Ottoman units followed against standing orders, vassal troops, reserve contingents. Formation discipline began fraying at the edges, not collapsing completely, but loosening dangerously. Men pushed forward faster, eager to participate in the final breakthrough, eager to finally end this nightmare campaign. Exactly what Stephen had planned with meticulous precision. Because the Moldavian vanguard wasn't retreating in panic or defeat, they were deliberately leading the Ottoman army into the valley's throat, into the killing ground Stephen had prepared. The Ottoman center pushed deeper into the narrowing valley, pursuing what they believed were defeated Moldavians. Janissaries first, maintaining better discipline than the others but still advancing quickly. Then the supporting units. Then, against explicit standing orders from their commanders, portions of the reserve forces. The momentum felt absolutely unstoppable, irresistible. After 3 weeks of frozen hell, they were finally winning. Then the ground itself betrayed them. What had appeared to be relatively flat, snow-covered terrain from a distance revealed itself to be treacherously broken and uneven up close. The frozen stream crossings that had seemed solid suddenly cracked under the concentrated weight of thousands of armored men. Snowdrifts concealed ditches that twisted ankles and shattered formation lines. Hidden obstacles broke up unit cohesion. The Janissaries desperately tried to maintain their legendary discipline and formation integrity, but the valley's narrowing geography compressed them together. Units that had advanced in beautifully organized blocks now found themselves bunched shoulder to shoulder, unable to maneuver properly, unable to respond to threats from multiple directions. The Moldavian artillery opened fire. Only a handful of guns, Stefan's entire artillery reserve, but positioned perfectly on high ground, with clear, unobstructed lines of sight down into the compressed valley. Stone and metal balls tore through the packed Ottoman formations with devastating effect. A single shot could kill 5 or 6 men if they were compressed tightly enough, and they were packed together like cattle in a pen. The psychological effect was even worse than the actual casualties. Cannon fire in extremely close quarters. The sound alone, the thunderous crashes, made even veteran soldiers flinch, duck, break their concentration. Officers screamed themselves hoarse trying to hold formation discipline, but you can't maintain perfect formation when the man standing next to you just disappeared in a spray of blood and bone fragments. Then the crossbow volleys started in earnest. Moldavian archers positioned in the concealed forests on both flanks, invisible until this moment, began loosing coordinated volleys into the exposed Ottoman sides. Not scattered individual shots, massed volleys. Hundreds of steel-tipped bolts hitting completely exposed flanks where there was no shield wall, no cover, no protection. The Sipai cavalry on both wings, who were supposed to be executing their flanking maneuvers to encircle the enemy, discovered to their horror that they couldn't advance. The terrain that had looked reasonably passable from a distance was actually thick with trees, undergrowth, snowdrifts, natural obstacles. Horses couldn't charge through it effectively, and the moment they slowed down or stopped, Moldavian archers hidden in those same forests cut them down mercilessly. Suleiman, watching the battle develop from his command position, realized with cold horror what was actually happening. This wasn't a conventional battle, this was a carefully prepared ambush, a trap, and he'd marched his entire army directly into it. He began shouting urgent orders to halt the advance, consolidate positions, pull back to defensible ground. His officers frantically relayed the commands down the chain of command. Some units heard the orders and tried desperately to comply. Others, already fully committed to combat and under withering fire from multiple directions, simply couldn't disengage safely. The Ottoman army, 120,000 strong on paper at the campaign's start, was fragmenting in real time before Suleiman's horrified eyes. And Stefan, watching from his elevated position with cold calculation, saw the exact moment he'd been waiting for, the moment he'd engineered through 3 weeks of calculated suffering. The Ottoman center was disordered and compressed, the flanks were pinned down and unable to maneuver, morale was visibly cracking. He turned to his heavy cavalry commanders and spoke 2 words that would echo through history. Now, strike. The Moldavian heavy cavalry burst from the concealed flanking forests on both sides simultaneously like wolves falling on wounded prey. Boyar lancers, armored, mounted on massive war horses specifically bred for shock impact, hit the completely exposed Ottoman flanks like collapsing stone walls. These weren't desperate wild charges into prepared, ready infantry formations. Stephen had timed it with absolute precision. Strike against units already disrupted, already under devastating fire, already struggling desperately to maintain any kind of cohesion. The impact was utterly catastrophic. Ottoman soldiers compressed in the valley's throat, unable to form proper defensive squares or respond effectively to threats from multiple directions, were ridden down before they could even react. Heavy lances punched through armor like it was cloth. War horses trampled men who tried to stand and fight. The Moldavian cavalry wasn't trying to break through the Ottoman lines and continue onward. They were trying to shatter the army completely, and it was working horrifyingly well. The Ottoman left flank folded first. Wallachian vassal troops, already demoralized, already fighting people they had no desire to kill, broke ranks completely and ran.
No dramatic final stands, no heroic last words. They just ran for their lives. That collapse opened a massive gap in the Ottoman defensive line. Moldavian infantry, sensing the moment, poured through that gap like water through a broken dam, hitting the exposed rear of the Janissary formations that were still trying desperately to advance up the center against the main Moldavian line. Now the elite Janissaries found themselves being attacked simultaneously from the front and the rear. They tried to pivot, to form proper defensive positions, to hold their ground. And to their eternal credit, they fought like the professionals they were. The Janissaries didn't panic easily. They'd been trained from childhood to stand firm in the face of death itself. But professionalism and training don't stop arrows. They don't stop cavalry charges from multiple directions at once. They don't stop exhaustion and weeks of starvation from catching up when you're fighting desperately for your life. One by one, Janissary units were isolated, surrounded, systematically overwhelmed. The Sipahi cavalry on the right flank, seeing the catastrophic collapse on the left, tried desperately to break off their stalled flanking maneuver and return to support the disintegrating center. But disengaging from active combat is infinitely harder than starting a fight. Moldavian light cavalry harassed them relentlessly the entire way back. By the time they finally reached the center of the battle, it had already turned into a slaughter. Suleiman Pasha, from his increasingly useless command position, watched his magnificent army disintegrate before his eyes. Officers were shouting contradictory orders to units that could no longer hear them. Entire formations were retreating without permission, without orders, simply trying to survive. The center was collapsing completely. The flanks were gone, shattered. And the Moldavians weren't stopping, weren't showing any mercy. They were pressing forward relentlessly with cold determination, giving no time to regroup, no space to breathe. He made the decision every commander dreads making, the decision that ends careers and lives. Save whatever you can. He gave the order for a full, immediate retreat. But executing a coordinated retreat requires several things: coordination, discipline, and soldiers who still believe their officers can get them out alive. The Ottoman army had none of those things remaining. The organized retreat became a chaotic rout within minutes.
The pursuit continued relentlessly into the night. Torches flickering in the darkness, screams in multiple languages, the sound of horses and steel, men begging in words no one bothered to translate or care about. By dawn on January 11th, the valley near Vaslui was a frozen graveyard stretching for miles. Bodies everywhere, Ottoman mostly, but Moldavian too. This hadn't been a clean, easy victory. This had been bought with blood. The blood had turned the snow into red slush that refroze overnight. Wounded men who couldn't move, couldn't escape, froze to death where they lay. Scavengers, both human and animal, were already picking methodically through the dead. The count, as best as anyone could manage in that chaos, was absolutely staggering. Between 40,000 and 45,000 Ottoman dead, maybe more. Some bodies were never found, lost forever in forests or buried under snowdrifts. For context, that represents roughly 40% of the entire invasion force, gone in a single day of combat. Moldavian casualties were between 5,000 and 10,000 killed. Significant, painful, devastating for such a small nation, but survivable. The Janissary Corps, the elite core of Ottoman military power for generations, had been gutted. The vassal contingents were completely shattered. The Sipahi cavalry had lost thousands of experienced riders. Ottoman artillery, baggage trains, supplies, military equipment, all captured by Moldavian forces. Hatem Suleiman Pasha survived the slaughter. He managed to rally a few thousand men from the wreckage and began the long, nightmarish retreat back to Ottoman-controlled territory. Moldavian cavalry and Crimean Tatar forces, smelling blood and weakness, harassed them constantly the entire way. Starvation, cold, disease, and ambushes killed hundreds more every single day. By the time Suleiman finally crossed back into Ottoman-controlled Wallachia, he had less than half the army he'd started with. He'd been sent to conquer Moldavia in a single decisive campaign.
He'd returned with the worst Ottoman military defeat in an entire generation, and Stephen III of Moldavia, outnumbered 3-1, had just accomplished what everyone in Europe said was absolutely impossible. He'd beaten the empire that couldn't be beaten. News of Vaslui spread through Christian Europe like wildfire. Messengers rode west to Hungary, Poland, the Italian states, carrying reports that seemed too incredible to believe. Within weeks, the story reached Rome, Venice, Vienna. A small, barely significant principality had just destroyed an Ottoman army 3 times its size. Not merely defeated, destroyed. Pope Sixtus IV received the detailed report in February. He read it twice, absolutely certain there must be some error in translation. When his advisors confirmed every detail, he officially declared Stephen III Athelata Christi, champion of Christ, and called for prayers of thanksgiving across Catholic Europe. This wasn't merely propaganda or empty religious rhetoric. It was desperation finally finding something to hope for. Constantinople had fallen 22 years earlier. That wound was still raw, still bleeding in European consciousness. The Ottoman advance had seemed inevitable, methodical, professional, utterly unstoppable. Every Christian kingdom that stood against them had been crushed or forced into humiliating vassalage. The psychological weight of that crushing reality was breaking European morale. Vaslui changed the fundamental equation. If tiny Moldavia could beat them, perhaps they weren't truly invincible. Perhaps the tide could actually be turned. Letters poured into Stephen's court from across the continent. Venice offered lucrative trade deals. Hungary proposed formal military alliances. Poland, already technically allied with Moldavia, suddenly became far more interested in actually honoring that alliance with material support. Even the Papal States sent money and effusive encouragement. Stephen went from being a border warlord to a continental hero virtually overnight. Chronicles written in Latin, Italian, and German praised him as the defender of Christendom. Artists depicted him as a warrior saint. Poets compared him to Alexander, to Caesar, to Charlemagne himself. He was 42 years old, and he just achieved what every Christian prince had been desperately trying to do for decades: prove that the Ottomans could bleed. But while Europe celebrated and praised, Stephen stood in the smoldering ruins of his own country and did the cold mathematics. Vaslui had cost him 7,000 dead soldiers. The Scorched Earth campaign had destroyed approximately a third of Moldavia's villages completely. Thousands of civilians had died during the brutal winter evacuation. Cold, starvation, disease. The ones who survived had nothing whatsoever to return to. And Mehmed II, the Sultan who'd conquered Constantinople, who'd never tolerated defiance from anyone, who viewed defeat as a personal insult to be avenged, was still alive and still ruling. Stephen knew with absolute certainty what was coming next. Not another punitive raid, not another standard invasion. Total, complete annihilation.
Summer 1476, 15 months after Vaslui, Mehmed assembled an army in Thrace. Not delegating through subordinates this time, he would lead it personally. The humiliation of Vaslui wasn't just a military setback to be absorbed. It was an existential threat to Ottoman prestige and authority. Mehmed had built his entire reputation on unstoppable conquest. He'd taken Constantinople at 21. He'd crushed every rebellion, defeated every rival, expanded the empire further than any sultan in history. And now a prince from a backwards, insignificant principality had killed 45,000 of his soldiers and made him look weak before the entire world. Every vassal state was watching carefully. Every rival faction within the empire was whispering dangerous thoughts. If Moldavia could defy the Ottomans and survive, why couldn't others? Mehmed's response was to assemble the largest Ottoman army sent into Europe in the entire 15th century. Estimates range between 150,000 and 200,000 men. Janissaries, sipahis, vassal troops, conscripts from Anatolia, massive artillery trains, military engineers, everything the empire could mobilize. His objective wasn't mere occupation or vassalage, it was erasure. Make Moldavia a lesson that no one in the world would ever forget.
Stephen, watching from Moldavia, knew he couldn't win this fight the same way. Vaslui had worked because Suleiman's army had arrived exhausted and starving after weeks of winter campaigning. But Mehmed was coming in summer, not winter. He had vastly more men, vastly more supplies, and he absolutely would not make the same mistakes. So Stephen adjusted his strategy accordingly. He evacuated the civilian population again, this time to heavily fortified cities and across the border into Poland. He burned what little was left to burn, and instead of offering a single decisive battle, he waged pure, relentless guerrilla warfare. Hit supply lines constantly, ambush scouting parties, burn bridges, poison wells, retreat systematically before superior forces. Never, ever let Mehmed pin down the main Moldavian army for a decisive engagement. It was brilliant strategic thinking, and it wasn't enough. Mehmed's massive army swept through southern Moldavia like an unstoppable flood. Every village they found, even the ones already destroyed in 1475, they obliterated down to the foundations. Stone buildings were torn down completely. Wells were deliberately filled with corpses and debris. Forests were burned. Thousands of Moldavians who hadn't evacuated in time were captured. Some were killed on the spot. Others were chained and marched south to be sold in Ottoman slave markets, their lives destroyed. By late July, Mehmed reached Suceava, Moldavia's strongest fortress, Stephen's capital, and laid siege with his full army. Suceava's walls were thick stone, built on naturally high ground, reinforced carefully over decades. Inside were supplies, weapons, and a garrison commanded by officers who'd fought at Vaslui. They knew exactly what Ottoman conquest meant. They weren't opening those gates. Mehmed positioned his artillery and began the bombardment. For 3 brutal weeks, Ottoman cannons hammered the walls day and night. Stone cracked, entire sections collapsed. Assault teams tried repeatedly to storm the breaches and were thrown back with heavy casualties every time. The Janissaries tried again and again, same result. The garrison wasn't just defending passively, they were making Mehmed pay dearly for every single attempt. Meanwhile, Stephen was outside with the main Moldavian army, refusing to commit to a relief battle he knew he'd lose. Instead, he did what he'd done all summer long, bled the Ottomans through constant attrition. Moldavian cavalry raided Ottoman supply lines relentlessly. Baggage trains were ambushed, foraging parties were cut down, wells were poisoned before the Ottomans could secure them. Mehmed had brought truly massive supplies, but feeding 150,000 men for weeks while besieging a fortress that absolutely refused to fall was draining everything. Worse, disease started spreading through the sprawling Ottoman camp: dysentery, typhus, the usual killers of siege warfare. And the longer Mehmed stayed trapped in Moldavia, the more other problems appeared on his borders. Reports from Anatolia warned of unrest among rival factions who saw the Sultan distracted and vulnerable. Reports from Wallachia indicated the vassal prince was making independent decisions, testing Ottoman authority. Reports from his own camp showed morale collapsing among troops who'd been promised a quick campaign and now dying of disease in front of walls they couldn't break. By mid-August, Mehmed faced the same brutal calculations Suleiman had faced 15 months earlier. He could stay and watch his army slowly disintegrate from disease and attrition, or he could leave without achieving his stated objective. The difference was that Mehmed had a reputation strong enough to survive withdrawal if he could spin it correctly. He gave the order to lift the siege and march south. But before leaving Moldavian territory, he turned southern Moldavia into an absolute wasteland. Every structure still standing was systematically destroyed. Every field was salted. Every well was filled with rotting corpses. The message was brutally clear. You didn't win. You just survived long enough for me to lose.
Stephen, watching the Ottoman army finally retreat south, knew that Mehmed was absolutely right. Suceava still stood. Moldavia was still independent. But half the country was simply gone. Not occupied, erased. The villages burned in 1475 had been destroyed again in 1476. The survivors from the first invasion were now refugees from the second. This was victory, yes, because Moldavia still existed as an independent state, and that mattered more than anything else. Stephen rebuilt, because that's what princes do after wars destroy everything. Villages were painstakingly reconstructed, though many were never repopulated. The people were simply gone. Fields were replanted, though entire regions stayed empty for years. Refugees returned slowly to find absolutely nothing left of the homes they'd abandoned twice. The chronicles faithfully record Stephen's victories. They list the battles, the casualty figures, the strategic importance. 47 years on the throne, over 40 battles fought, only 2 defeats. What the chronicles don't record are the human costs hidden between those clean numbers. The peasant family who evacuated in December 1474 lost their youngest child to the cold, returned in spring 1475 to rebuild from nothing, then burned everything again in 1476 and never came back because hope had finally died. The Moldavian soldier who survived Vaslui lost an arm to infection and spent the rest of his life begging because he couldn't farm anymore, and the state had no system to care for disabled veterans. The Janissary, taken from a Christian village as a boy, converted, trained, sent to die fighting other Christians at Vaslui, whose original family never knew what happened to him. The Wallachian vassal who fled during the battle, made it home and was executed by Ottoman authorities for cowardice. His only crime was refusing to die for an empire that had conquered his country. The strategic logic of Vaslui was absolutely brilliant. Scorched earth denied the Ottomans essential resources. Terrain negated their numerical superiority. Timing exploited their physical and psychological exhaustion. But strategy is clean and elegant on paper. The human cost is chaos and tragedy. Every military victory in history is built on countless individual tragedies that no one bothers counting or remembering. The mother who evacuated with 3 children and arrived with 1. The farmer who watched his land burn twice and decided survival wasn't worth the cost anymore. The soldier who did everything right and still died screaming in the frozen snow. Stephen understood this better than most rulers. He made the call knowing exactly what it would cost his people, and he made it anyway because the alternative was objectively worse. That's not heroism in any conventional sense. That's just leadership in a world where all your available options are terrible, and you have to choose the least terrible one and live with the consequences. Moldavia survived. That was the point. That was always the only point that mattered. But survival came at a price that didn't show up in chronicles or victory celebrations. It showed up in empty villages, in the haunted faces of people who'd lost everything twice, in the permanent silence of families who would never be whole again. And Stephen, champion of Christ, defender of Moldavia, the prince who beat the Ottomans, carried that crushing weight for the next 28 years. Because the war didn't really end in 1476. In that part of the world, the war never truly ended. Vaslui didn't stop the Ottoman Empire. That needs to be stated clearly, because the story gets dangerously mythologized. One battle, even a catastrophic defeat, doesn't break an empire that controls 3 continents. The Ottomans came back in 1476, and they came back even stronger than before. They'd return again in 1484 and successfully seize Moldavian fortresses on the Black Sea coast. They'd conquer Hungary 50 years later. They'd besiege Vienna twice. The Ottoman Empire wouldn't collapse for another 4 centuries. So what did Vaslui actually accomplish in the larger historical context? Time. It bought precious years. Years where Hungary, Poland, and Moldavia could prepare better defenses, form more effective alliances, build the military infrastructure to resist more successfully. In geopolitics, time isn't an abstract concept. It's literally the difference between facing an invasion when you're ready versus facing it when you're completely unprepared. Vaslui also exposed critical Ottoman vulnerabilities that other commanders studied and exploited for generations. Overextended supply lines in hostile territory, vassal troops who'd break under sustained pressure, numerical superiority meaning absolutely nothing on restrictive terrain, the devastating psychological impact of winter, hunger, and constant harassment.
These weren't secrets before Vaslui, but Stephen proved they could be weaponized decisively against even the greatest empire. Hungarian commanders studied the battle carefully when preparing for their own Ottoman wars. Polish strategists analyzed it in detail. Even Austrian generals a century later, during the famous 1683 siege of Vienna, referenced the fundamental principles: control logistics, choose your ground, make the enemy fight on your terms. Vaslui became a template, a case study in asymmetric warfare. But its deeper impact was psychological. For 22 years after Constantinople fell, Christian Europe had operated under the crushing assumption that Ottoman conquest was ultimately inevitable. You could delay it, negotiate with it, buy time, but you couldn't actually stop it. Vaslui shattered that assumption. Not permanently, not decisively, but enough to prove that the Ottomans weren't divinely invincible, that brilliant generalship could overcome numerical superiority, that resistance wasn't futile.
It stiffened Hungarian resolve. It gave Polish kings critical leverage in negotiations. Stephen didn't save Europe single-handedly. He bought it a chance to save itself. And sometimes that's all any leader can do. Stephen III ruled Moldavia until 1504, 47 years total. He was 71 when he died, ancient by medieval standards, especially for someone who'd spent his entire adult life at war. The battles didn't stop after Vaslui. He fought the Ottomans again in 1485, 1486, 1487. He fought the Poles in 1497 when they invaded over a territorial dispute, defeated them at the Battle of the Kosman Forest. He fought Hungarian incursions, Tatar raids that never stopped, rival claimants who thought his throne was vulnerable. Over 40 battles in 47 years. He lost 2. That record isn't luck or divine favor. It's obsessive preparation, ruthless pragmatism, and understanding that survival required constant, exhausting vigilance. When he was buried at Putna Monastery, the church he'd founded, chroniclers called him the greatest prince Moldavia ever had. Not because he was merciful or universally beloved, but because he'd kept them free when every neighboring state had been conquered or absorbed. 5 centuries later, in 1992, the Romanian Orthodox Church canonized him, Saint Stephen the Great, defender of the faith, protector of Christian Europe. Modern Romania claims him as a founding figure of Romanian national identity. His image appears on currency, in textbooks, on monuments. January 10th, the anniversary of Vaslui, is commemorated as a day of remembrance. But here's where historical memory gets complicated and political. The Republic of Moldova, independent since 1991, also claims Stephen as their national hero. He's on their currency too. His fortresses are Moldovan heritage sites. His legacy is taught as fundamentally Moldovan history. Romanians argue he was Proto-Romanian. Moldovans argue he founded Moldovan statehood. Ukrainians accurately point out that parts of his territory are now in Ukraine. Historical figures become battlegrounds for modern identity politics. Everyone wants to claim the heroes as their own ancestors. What's undeniable, regardless of modern borders and nationalist claims, is this: Stephen understood something most rulers didn't, and still don't. Empires don't respect abstract strength. They respect concrete cost. Make conquest expensive enough in blood and treasure, and even the strongest empire will eventually look elsewhere for easier prizes. That's what Vaslui proved. Not that small nations can reliably beat empires in direct confrontation, but that they can make empires pay so much blood that the prize stops being worth it. And sometimes that's the only victory actually available. January 10th, 1475, a frozen valley in Eastern Europe. 40,000 Moldavians facing 120,000 Ottomans. The empire that had conquered Constantinople, crushed the Balkans, and terrified Christian Europe for decades, comprehensively defeated. Not by superior numbers, not by divine intervention, but by a prince who understood that wars are won before the first sword is ever drawn. Stephen didn't outfight the Ottomans at Vaslui. He outthought them at every stage. He turned their strengths into fatal vulnerabilities. Their size became an impossible logistics nightmare. Their experience became dangerous arrogance. Their momentum became fatal overextension. And when they finally reached the battlefield, exhausted and starving, he destroyed them. But here's the part that matters most, the lesson that echoes through military academies 5 centuries later. Stephen knew this victory wouldn't last forever.
He knew Mehmed would come back with vengeance. He knew the Ottomans had vastly more soldiers, more resources, more everything. He knew one battle, even a catastrophic Ottoman defeat, wouldn't fundamentally change the balance of power. So why fight at all? Because survival isn't about winning forever, it's about lasting long enough that the enemy decides you're not worth the cost anymore. That's what Vaslui accomplished in the longer view. It didn't save Europe, it didn't end the Ottoman threat, it just made them reconsider whether Moldavia was worth another 45,000 dead soldiers. And that reconsideration bought time, years, decades, enough for Moldavia to remain independent for another generation, for neighboring kingdoms to prepare their defenses, for the psychological grip of Ottoman invincibility to weaken just enough. Most medieval battles are forgotten footnotes in obscure chronicles. Vaslui is still studied 5 centuries later because it proved something that still matters today. Empires can be resisted. Numbers don't automatically guarantee victory. And sometimes the greatest act of leadership is choosing the terrible option that keeps your people free instead of the comfortable option that gets them enslaved. Stephen III died in 1504 at 71 after 47 years of nearly constant warfare. His country had been burned, rebuilt, burned again, rebuilt again. His people had suffered losses that no chronicle could ever fully capture. But Moldavia was still there, still independent. And that was the entire point.